Hello and welcome to Out of Frame Behind the Scenes, a podcast about the intersection between art, culture, and big ideas. I'm Paul Nelson, filling in for Sean Malone, who will not be with us this week or next week. But as always, I am joined by Jen Mafasanti, the Communications Director for Libertas Institute. Jen, how are you?
I am hanging in there. We have been dealing with the sickness in my house this week.
The
Not
sickness?
COVID,
Okay.
not COVID, not the flu, and not strep throat. We got tested for all of those things, but it is pretty miserable. Thankfully, I'm mostly over it. But if you hear me coughing, that's why. It's not the Rona, it's just a summer cold.
Just a summer cold. Well, I mean, is it still summer in Utah or is it like negative 30?
I mean, it's just hanging on. Today is a Thursday. So that's a little insight into when we record these things. So today is a Thursday, and we've got highs in like the upper 80s, low 90s across the state. But starting Sunday, it's going to drop like 25 degrees, like it saw a state trooper.
Yes, I mean, it is that time of year. And, you know, those colds, they can be a little nagging, a little scary. Sometimes it just leaves you wondering, what is this? And I think
Is
that
this, is
transition,
this, should we say malignant?
I think we should. What a great
Hey.
transition to the movie we're talking about today, Malignant. It is out now in theaters and on the Max. It's one of those you can, if you got HBO Max, you can go watch it right now and then come back and join us for this discussion. But this is directed by, I'm not a big fan of horror, the horror genre in general, but it is directed by what I think many would say one of the best horror directors going right now, James Wan of Saw, Insidious, The Conjuring, and a little movie called Aquaman fame. So it's a great director. He also, the screenplay was written by him. So let's just dive right in. Jen, can you give us a quick synopsis of Malignant?
All right. So in Malignant, we are introduced to our main character, Maddie, who is a nurse, I guess, although she never seems to go to work. And when we meet her, she is pregnant. She has an abusive husband. Things that are not going super great for her. And her husband hits her. She hits her head. And that night, some mysterious, long haired, black clad specter gruesomely murders the abusive husband. And that kind of sets off this weird sort of waking dream sort of situation for Maddie, in which she sees this specter gruesomely murdering just so many people. And the police think that Maddie is the killer, but she tells them that no, it's her imaginary friend from childhood, Gabriel. And more than that gets into some pretty heavy spoilers. So it's sort of a possession horror movie in
Mm-hmm.
that Maddie is seeing these murders being carried out as though she's there in the house with Gabriel and the victims. And it's a problem for her, as you might imagine.
Yeah, front row seats to a brutal murder. Not great. So I think we're gonna have to get into spoilers because this movie, the only interesting things are something that's gonna be spoiled. So
Yeah.
if you really do want to watch this, hit the pause button, go to the Max, watch it, come back. But with that being said, Malignant, was this a serious attempt at a horror movie, or was it something else?
It's so hard to tell because there are some lines in this movie that really should be played for laughs, but they're not. This is a movie that, for all appearances, seems to take itself very, very seriously. It's very dry, it's very straight. Like there's no sense of irony or wink and a nod or anything like that. It's there in front of God and everyone, right? But situationally, the way just the words used in the dialogue, it feels like this should be a satire,
Mm-hmm.
but I'm not convinced that it is.
See, I was struggling with this one. Like I said earlier, I'm not a fan of horror, so when Jin wanted to watch this movie, I was not excited, but it was on the Max, so of course I was going to watch it. But I was this first act. I'm thinking, okay, this is bad. This is not scary. It's not interesting. But by the time the third act turned around and you could see what was happening, I think I could finally figure out what this was, and it was a satire. It was in my mind. I hope it was satire because at the end, so just spoilers out on the table. Maddie has a deformed sibling attached to her back
Yeah, a parasitic twin.
that somehow could control her brain and show her images. So what the doctors did before they let her out into the world, they they cut off most of it, but the stuff they couldn't cut off, they just shoved into her head and sewed up her skull because that makes sense. But when this
As
creature
one does.
right, I mean it's just normal everyday medical practice.
Mhm.
So when we finally get the big reveal that Maddie is being controlled by this thing, she starts working backwards because it's on her back, on the back of her head, and so it's just hilarious. It's just so funny, and that's when it really hit me that this was not taking itself seriously. I mean, I haven't seen anything from the director to say that this wasn't a serious take, but seeing his history and how much people loved, I mean, just love Saw and Insidious and all of those franchises, not just one-off movies, but franchises that he spawned. I can't imagine he would just roll out of bed like, yeah, I'm going to make a terrible movie on purpose today. So it made me laugh more than jump scares or anything like that. It was a pretty funny movie. The characters, this is one of the things that really gets me about horror movies, it's a trope in horror movies that they just make bad decisions. And there are bad decisions made throughout the movie. Probably the worst one was Maddie's sister Sydney driving alone to the abandoned insane asylum medical facility that's on the side of a cliff outside of Seattle, and then not just going there by herself at the dead of night, but parking her car on the edge of the cliff, mere inches from the edge of it, and then she walked. So okay, this little
It's
why was there wheelchairs from the 1800s or 19th century rolling around? This was being used in the 1990s. I know that's a long ways back now, but my goodness, they had like wooden wheelchairs just rolling around.
because that's what the script said, Paul. That there was a lot of because that's what the script says happens going on in this movie. And I want desperately to believe that this was a joke. But if it was a joke, it did not land for me. This was just ah the entire time. And the characters, yes, they make terrible decisions, but they're also incredibly flat.
Mm-hmm.
Like there's no growth or change or any development whatsoever. It's all just like implied backstory and they're pretty, so you should care about them kind of mentality going on with this.
I mean, you're not wrong. You're not wrong. Maybe I'm just reading way too much into this, and can't imagine that somebody who's like that loved the final cut. Yeah, that's a good movie. That's a good way to spend $40 million right there. Which brings me to the next, like, how does this get made? Warner, this is a Warner Brothers movie. This is not some small indie studio that James was working with. This was Warner Brothers. This was a huge studio. And I just blows my mind that this even happened in the first place. And was anybody paying attention from Warner Brothers? It doesn't seem like it. This is just, it just blows my mind. I really can't even think of, it's go Jen, because I'm lost for words. This movie was so bad.
Okay, so I am generally inclined to say that I do not enjoy horror movies, but that is incorrect. I don't enjoy bad horror movies. And unfortunately, the vast majority of what gets labeled a horror movie is just garbage. I do actually enjoy really good horror movies. Like when I think about it, I'm like, oh yeah, The Shining, Silence of the Lambs, The Exorcist, The Omen, even Get Out. Like those were really good movies that also happened to be horror movies. And I think what happens with a lot of modern horror movie makers is that they lean into the horror, which isn't really horrific. It's just like gruesome and violent and jump scares, which is not the same thing to me. But they lean into that part of it, and then they forget the actual good movie part of it. And they're just like, yay, thrills. And that does not make an awesome movie. So yeah, that's where this movie falls for me. It was trying to do a lot of interesting things, but it tried to do too many interesting things, and so that means that it didn't do any of them well. So we had some, I want to say nods. I don't want to call it homage because it doesn't really do any of these themes justice, but we see nods to like Dario Argento movies with just the vividness of the blood and the brutality. And then we also get some sort of Cronenberg-esque body horror going on with the way that Gabriel comes out the back of Maddie's skull there. And we also get, he nods back to his own Saw movies with just the gore and the gruesomeness. But like, it's just like when you put it all together, along with like the J horror the ring type visuals, it just doesn't gel. It doesn't work. It feels very muddy. Like there wasn't a real singular vision to any of this. And if this is indeed a satire, as you and I would like to believe, like you need to pick one or two things that you're trying to lambast here. If you do all of the things, none of the jokes land, and none of the jokes landed for me.
Yeah, it's almost like if you're gonna do a satire, this was just too well made. There was a shot in particular towards the beginning of the film where obviously this movie was filmed on a set, but they took a camera shot following Maddie top down throughout her entire house, which the house doesn't make sense if they did a ton of outside shots and the house is way smaller on the outside than it is on the inside, which is typical of these kind of movies. But it's actually a really beautiful shot, really interesting shot, and gives you it's like, oh, are you trying to tell us something by this shot? Which turns out really no. But there's things like that where this is just too good. It's just too well made and to be just this bad. So having said all of that, what we usually like to try to do on Out of Frame, just the series, but also this podcast, is try to find the intersection between big ideas and movies and culture, like I said at the beginning of the podcast. So was there anything in this movie that we could pull out that it was trying to say? Because a lot of times horror movies do have some messages. I mean, you go back to the zombie movies when they first started, consumerism, things like that. Is there anything like that that jumped out to you?
Well, if it did it, it didn't say it well. But I think one of the big things about possession horror movies, which if we're going to pick a single subgenre for this movie, I think that would be it, is this notion that the devil made me do it, right? It takes accountability off of the individual person for the horrific things that they have done. And if, in fact, possession is a real thing, then I suppose that would be valid, but it's not exactly as though you can take a demon or a parasitic twin that lives on the back of your skull to court. You know, you can't put just that entity in jail for what they've done. But I think we can agree that it's pretty far-fetched to think that that happens in reality. So shifting the blame from individual action to some amorphous evil force is not a particularly healthy way to view the world. There needs to be individual human accountability for the things that we do wrong.
Look at that. Even with all of the stuff, Jen was able to pull out something, a great lesson that we can all learn from. Well, for me, I found it was pretty heavy-handed. I thought it was the idea that women. This movie is about women being in possessive relationships. Maddie was possessive and abusive relationships. Maddie was abused by her husband, physically, emotionally. Pretty obvious. I mean, obviously, they made it very clear. The husband was actually just the very stereotypical, over the top.
He was a bit on the nose.
It was pretty bad. But that was very obviously the beginning of the movie. But then we come all the way back to the end of the movie when she locks Gabriel in prison, in her mind.
Her brain prison.
And she is basically freeing herself from another possessive, abusive male relationship, which is Gabriel. And she is now supposedly free until we get Malignant 2, which this very heavily hinted at, which I kind of want, honestly. This movie was, the more I think about it, the more I just, it's funny. I just
wish they'd leaned into it. I just wish they'd acknowledged it instead of trying to play it so straight.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I mean, it took me a while until the very end action sequence when she starts murdering brutally all the other women in her prison cell. That was just which also just had a weird mismatch of styles. You had a 70s big afro woman. You had a 80s trailer park.
That scene was so cringe. Like, it was just insultingly stereotypical.
She at one point ripped the arm off of a police officer and used it to bludgeon another one to death. So,
as one does.
But she's doing this all backwards with a very bad CGI face. It's so bad it's good. But I couldn't help but feeling that this was at its core a movie about getting out of abusive relationships, and taking responsibility for that, which is hard. I mean, that's a very real issue that many women face, and it's difficult. And I think you kind of, going off what you said earlier, taking responsibilities for your actions and not trying to blame it on someone else. That's a good first step of trying to rectify sometimes of those kind of situations. So, yeah, Malignant.
This movie, goodness, it missed on so many levels for me, and I it could have been a good movie, but so many of the intangibles, like it's not even just the writing. It's the visuals, it's thematically the score, like just ease back on the strings section, man.
They
But
kept doing a reinterpretation of a song, and I cannot remember what the name of the song is, but
oh, it was Where Is My Mind by the Pixies, and
oh,
that drove me bonkers because I love that song. But you're not Fight Club, man. Leave
they
that one
tried.
alone.
They tried. And another thing that I found interesting is that James Wan and his wife are the writing team on this,
Mhm.
and his wife was actually in the movie. She was the CSI investigator, and
Oh, she was okay, the nerdy one,
yeah, the one that was
thirsting after the detective.
right. It was yeah, not a great performance, but it all makes sense now after learning that. So, Jen, do you have any final thoughts about *Malignant*?
I wish it was a better movie. No, no, I take that back. I just wished it would have embraced the absurdity of what it was trying to get across. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
if it had any sense of irony whatsoever in the mood, in the line delivery, in anything, it would have been amazing and hilarious. As it was just shockingly boring and disjointed. And why? Why is this movie? I have to, like, I feel like someone lost a bet here, and this was the result.
Yeah, I wonder if it was a bet between husband and wife. Then he lost. I don't know. But
I mean,
would you recommend this to anyone?
I would recommend this only with the knowledge of what this movie is going into it. I did not read any reviews or any vague plot synopses at all going into this movie. All I had to go on was like the logline description that HBO Max displayed before
Can
you
I can I can I
hit the
read that
play
real
button.
quick? Can I
Yes,
read that?
please do.
Madison is paralyzed by shocking visions of grisly murders, and her torment worsens as she discovers that these waking dreams are, in fact, terrifying realities.
So with that as your introduction, as your lead in to this movie, it falls completely flat. But if you're like, "Oh, this is going to be an absurd and like just ridiculous horror movie and you should laugh the entire way through," I think this would have been a much better movie experience for me. And I would be a lot less angry about having watched it than I am now, even though this was my idea. But
Yeah, you know,
I get to be mad at you next week.
oh, we'll see, we'll see. We are on a roll. Yeesh. But yeah, I agree with Jen. I would actually recommend this movie to see because I honestly kind of wish I saw it in a theater. I think this is one of those movies you need to be watching with friends, watching it with strangers, and because I just want to know if are people laughing, or are they just going like, what? And I just need to know because I mean, but I think this would be something that would be a lot of fun watching in a theater, and I do genuinely miss that missed that opportunity because obviously watching it now, I know I feel like I'm in on the joke, but Yeah, I would recommend this, but I wouldn't say it's a good, like, recommend it because this is good filmmaking. Recommend it because you're gonna have a good time, and you're just gonna cringe at some bad horror, and then laugh at the end when a demonic being is running backwards but facing forward at the same time. It's something that you'll never thought you needed to see, but yeah, you do see it. So with that, we'll end it there. We'll wrap it there. I'm turned around, heading backwards. Yeah. So with that, we'll end the discussion about Malignant there. But we are going to keep going for our supporters. We have some great questions, some hard-hitting questions for you all, so you'll want to stick around for that. And if you want to join us, go over to Patreon and subscribe star, and you can show us some love and join us in that discussion after the break. But in the meantime, if you don't already, follow us on all the socials, follow us on YouTube. We're everywhere that you would want us to be. And yeah, join the Discord too. We got a lot of cool discussions, a lot of good questions coming from over there. It's a good time. So with that, thank you so much for watching or listening, and we'll see you next time.